It's interesting. I think we should point this out that um, when the Arab Spring happened, there were a lot of these uprisings, some democratic, but then in many countries, jihadists quickly took over, as in Syria. And Hamas actually joined the jihadists. They were major supporters, and I think sent soldiers there to fight alongside the jihadists, the Al Qaeda types, and their allies, against the Syrian government, but also against Hezbollah. They actually fought Hezbollah and killed Hezbollah soldiers. And I think it just shows really the magnanimity, the greatness of spirit of actually Hezbollah, that, when they didn't hold a grudge against Hamas. They would have every right to do so. But when October 7th happened, and then and that was followed by the Israeli invasion and the genocide, they quickly stood by and made clear that they were a supporter of Hamas. And in fact, they they're one of the very, very few groups that backed up their words with real action. They began to fire the rockets into northern Israel. But it's easy to forget that episode. There was a time when Hamas was a lethal opponent of the axis of resistance, but now they've been, that's all forgotten, and they're embraced and supported by the axis of resistance now.
Yeah, I actually remember that because I was in Palestine when that happened. This was I was there in 2013, I believe, or something around then, and I was staying with it was just a Palestinian family in the West Bank, and I remember talking to the father, and he said he was leaving to fight Bashar al-Assad in Syria. He was going up there, and I had no idea what was going on. I was just a young kid, and I was like, I barely understood the conflict at the time, and I was like, this seems weird. You have a wife and 2 kids here, and you're going to leave to go fight in Syria. But I do remember that was a real thing, and then I have thought about that before, and now it's like the Hezbollah, the axis of resistance, is in support of Hamas when, like you said, they were actually against it. I never fully understood why. Was it just a Sunni-Shiite thing, or?
Yeah, well, I mean, the Sunni-Shi'a divide was very real, and that had been for decades, centuries. One thing is people forget that Al Qaeda. We always think about the Western victims of Al Qaeda. But most of their violence was actually directed against Shia. I would say, like, for every Westerner that was killed, probably 100 Shia Muslims were killed. So they were the spearhead of the attack against the Shia. And of course, Saudi Arabia and Iran were enemies. And in general, there was an effort, led by Saudi Arabia, to isolate and maybe even bring down, the Iranian regime. But that's past. I mean, it's not, there's, we can thank China in part, for mediating the reconciliation between Iran and Saudi Arabia. They buried the hatchets, and they are cooperating. A lot of people said, well, this can't be for real, but it seems to be for real. It really, so that, thanks to these mediation efforts, but then also I think it's quite serious. The conduct of the axis of resistance has won lots of friends among the Sunni communities throughout the Middle East. They see that it's actually the Shia that are fighting on behalf of Hamas and on behalf of the Palestinians. They're the ones who that are acting and are not just talking. Meanwhile, Erdogan goes on, with his fiery speeches, and the Saudi Arabian government makes statements. And actually, I heard just the other day, maybe it was today, they, for the first time, used the word genocide to describe what Israel was doing in Gaza. They're making statements, Saudi Arabia, right? So, but they're not backing up their statements with any kind of action. But the Shia are, the axis of resistance is, and Sunnis around the Middle East see that. And I think that if they had some sort of animosity, or suspicions of the Shias, it's gone, and they regard them as heroes, and they now stand shoulder to shoulder.
Yeah, it is fascinating that it's the Shiite world that is standing up for the Sunnis in Palestine.
Yeah.
The people forget that the Palestinians are Sunni Muslims, and it's the Shiites that's for some
Right.
reason are the only ones, and all the Sunni countries. I
Right.
guess essentially that's just evidence that that the U.S. Israel threw their hat in with the Sunni camp, and
Yeah.
and we were trying to. And that's what we do. We want to destabilize the region, so we keep that Sunni Shiite divide going as long as we can, and want to
Yeah.
make sure that they're in conflict with each other. Damn, we had what Saudi
Right.
Arabia was doing to Yemen, backed
Yeah.
by the United States. That's the Shiite Sunni conflict. When
Right.
Iraq invaded Iran, same thing. All these, and now that game's over. The divide, that Sunni Shiite divide, is been healed. Like I said, thanks to just sort of the honor of the Shiites, the way that they're standing up for the Sunni brothers, and doing so, I think, quite honorably, trying to avoid civilian casualties, while also
Right.
while civilian casualties are being inflicted heavily on these populations in Lebanon, and in Gaza, of course. So I think that means that the game is kind of up for Israel at this point, even if, let's say, everything stops and somehow everybody just forgets what happens the past year or two. The fact that the Sunnis and Shiites aren't being pitted against each other just changes the whole landscape for the Middle East, for the United States, and of course Israel. Most importantly, would you agree?
Yeah. Yeah, no, I do agree. I mean, it's a major shift. It was a very important development. I remember when the announcement was made, like a year or two ago, about the healing of the rift between Saudi Arabia and Iran. That was joyful news, but it was it was kind of, the announcements were very somber, like in the U.S. there wasn't any rejoicing. Hey, peace is breaking out. I say, peace is breaking out. Oh no, this is because obviously this went against U.S. interests. They were in favor of that divide, and they helped to stoke it, and the Israelis did too. So this was for them a major defeat.
Right, but we shouldn't even say U.S. interests. It was against Israeli interests. And we led ourselves to those interests.
I think that's true. I mean, it essentially is true. But Israel, and by extension the U.S., you could say.
Do you see any sign of these Sunni countries doing more? No. I mean, Saudi Arabia, at least they said they're using the word genocide. At least, like,
right.
Right.
I mean, they have moderated their policies. I mean, prior to October 7th, there was a chance of complete normalization of relations between Saudi Arabia and I think some of the other Gulf states with Israel. That's off the table. They have, hardened their positions. And then, during the recent Israeli attack on Iran, they would not allow the Israelis to use their airspace or their bases in this country. So that's a shift, and that's significant. But they're not, Turkey in particular could really hurt Israel. Again, we've talked about that. If they cut off the oil to Israel, that could bring the whole war machine there to a halt. But Erdogan is just such a snake that he's not going to do it. It may get to the point where he's faced with a revolution within his own country, and that's what may happen in the other Sunni countries, because the Sunni people, by and large, are seething. They're very much on the side of the Palestinians, and they're very unhappy with their rulers. And so far that hasn't translated into real action against the rulers. It's hard, if you don't. You may have the numbers, but you don't have the army, you don't have the organization, you're still powerless. And I think that's what most of the people are finding. But there may be a coup somewhere. The dam may break, and we may find Sunni governments starting to fall and, to join the axis of resistance. We're certainly not there yet. There's no signs of it, but I could see it happening somewhere down the road.
Right. I mean, we see I think everybody's waiting to see what Iran does. And then the response from Israel, that could start to lead to.
I think, part of it is just, these governments live in fear of Israel for good reason. Jordan would be the best example. But if Iran can demonstrate its military superiority over Israel, that could change things. That will change their calculations.